The views and opinions expressed on this podcast is solely of the creator and may not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of the listener. Listener discretion is advised. Also, ChatGPT and AI technologies were not used or harmed in the creation of this podcast. It is 100% human-made by me, your host, Melanie. I'm a gal from Ohio, and if my accent don't bother you, we'll get along just fine. I created Under the Moon Paranormal. You can look for me on YouTube and social media platforms. I just love to hang out in cemeteries and explore all things spooky in my hometown and home state, Ohio. Okay, so here is your full moon report. It's eclipse season, you guys. Okay, so eclipse season is in full swing as the Pisces lunar eclipse graces our skies on September 17th, marking the beginning of an astrological cycle that will play out until February 20th, 2027, okay? As we dip our toes into a series of eclipses manifesting on the Virgo-Pisces axis, it'll be important to consider personal habits, triggers, and emotional well-being. There may be times when you feel torn between your dreams and the work required to reach them. While quest for perfection could lead to heartache, by the time you've reached the end of this astrological era, you'll find yourself changed emotionally, mentally, and perhaps physically, okay? So hold tight, people. It's going to get a little messy. To understand how these eclipses will impact you throughout the next 2.5 years, it can be helpful to touch base with your deepest emotions during this particular time. Pisces energy has a way of swelling our hearts and minds, making it easier to energetically merge with the people we encounter. For this reason, it'll be important that you find ways to protect your aura from outside influences, especially when you feel pulled towards introspection and personal healing. This lunar eclipse will highlight the effects other people have on you, for better or worse. In order to cultivate peace and quiet, you could feel called to set new boundaries with friends. And that's not a bad thing, colleagues, or even family. However, as your intuition intensifies under Luna's glow, you may find it difficult to draw lines if you're worried they will upset someone else. Emotions of those around you, will seem more pronounced during this time. And your empathetic nature could dissuade you from situations that might disappoint other people. But when it comes down to your well-being, it may be best to take a more practical and less emotional approach towards those you encounter. Another point worth considering is that if someone can't respect your request for space, they might not have your best interest at heart. It would be wise to brace yourself for pushback in the event that conflicts do arise, as Mercury and Saturn face off overhead. This celestial standoff could bring out dominating or bullying personalities, while arguing your own disposition might feel like a steep mountain to climb. Disagreements will cause arguments to drag on for much longer than they normally would, and it may be up to you to lay issues to rest before you have the chance to spiral. When resolution cannot be found, go the route of agree to disagree, and that's not a bad thing either. Across from Pisces, full moon sits on the Virgo sun, heightening the connection between your emotional and physical bodies. Take note of how you change physically when you face stress, difficult people, loving companions, and solitude. You will have a chance to master the way your body responds to outside events if you bring more awareness to these physical shifts. Movement and purposeful relaxation will come in handy under this cosmic climate, giving yourself space to push out whatever moments of tension, joy, and enthusiasm you find during this intense eclipse season. So, brace yourselves, everyone. It is the eclipse season, and it's going to start the harvest. So, September 22nd, I do believe, is the first day of fall. So we are transitioning our podcast into spooky season, which would be for September and October's episodes, okay? So this month, we're talking about vampires. So you heard that Netflix pulled a documentary series about a vampire coven and the mysterious circumstances around a missing person. Well, I think it's important to tell this story of this missing person, whether he was attacked by vampires or not. He's still a missing person, and he also has an urban legend attached to his spirit, which may or may not be true. So, anyway, that was your full moon report. So we're going to go ahead and do a little bit of history about vampires before we dive into the mysterious missing person case. Okay, so picture this. 1892, a group of frightened villagers in Exeter, Rhode Island, gathered at the town's graveyard with shovels and a grim task. Slowly but surely, they began to dig up fresh soil that covered the grave of 19-year-old Mercy Brown. Brown had died about 2 months earlier, but there was something about her death that unsettled the townspeople. They'd come to believe that she was a vampire, intent on draining the life of her sick brother. Brown allegedly found in her grave with lifelike flushy red cheeks, okay? They thought she still looked like she was just sleeping. The villagers convinced them that, she was a vampire, and they burned her heart and her liver. Okay, and then they had her brother consume the ashes, which, guess what? He died from probably consuming her ashes. So they exhumed. Their exhumation of Mary Brown sound excessive and dramatic today, but the villagers belong to a long history of people fearing vampires. Fanged and bloodthirsty, these supernatural creatures have stalked the darkest corners of human imagination for centuries. Vampires of the ancient world. Okay, so for as long as there has been humans, they have been afraid of the dark. Okay? They've been afraid of unseen monsters that may lurk in the dark. And the history of vampires is an age-old one. Many ancient cultures had vampire-like monsters in their mythology, though they had differed from modern-day legends. In Mesopotamia, people feared creatures called Ikimu, E-K-I-M-M-U, which could drain someone's life force. Meanwhile, an ancient Egyptian mythology describes the Sekhmet, the daughter of the sun god Ra, and had an insatiable thirst for human blood. The Jewish folklore had Lilith, believed by some to be the first wife of Adam, fed on her victims. Some stories suggest that Lilith is responsible for men's erotic dreams and cause them to, masturbate. So Lilith is supposed to be this bad girl character in the Bible. Could be a vampire, could be a demoness, who knows? But anyway, vampires do not like sunlight. They have fangs. They need life force, whether blood, seed, or physical energy. They need something of life force to survive. So there's a report from Old Russian text written in 1047, which describes monsters called Upir, U-P-I-R. The term vampire, however, didn't appear until centuries later in text in 1725. In that year, frightened villagers located in modern-day Serbia, like I said, I'm from Ohio, people, bear with me, appealed to health and safety officials called the communal provisor for help. They believed that the dead man named Peter Blaklovich was responsible for spreading disease and death throughout their village. Not only had his widow claimed that she had seen him, but 9 other villagers also insisted that he laid himself upon them and throttled them during the night. And about 24 hours later, all these people that seen him died. The provisor, a man named Fromblad, wrote to his supervisors that the villagers knew exactly what they were dealing with, a vampire, the Siberian word for back from the dead. Fromblad himself conducted the autopsy and found that Blaklovich's corpse seemed completely fresh and even had fresh blood around his mouth. When determined, villagers drove a stake through Blaklovich's corpse. Okay. So today we know that the Siberians were hardly alone when they took their crusade against the vampire into their own hands. In recent years, archaeologists have uncovered vampire graveyards in Poland, where they found a woman buried with a sickle, laid across her neck, and a child with a padlock around their ankles, both dating from the 17th century, as well as a mass grave of decapitated vampires from between the 18th and 19th century, with coins in their mouths and bricks weighing them down. Like the case of Mercy Brown, villagers of Kowalsko killed the undead Blavakovich to stop him from spreading disease around his village. The villagers in Poland probably did something similar, though it's possible that some vampires in those cases were merely just social outcasts, okay? So, how disease spread from modern vampires? Okay, so those older cases, vampires were used to explain the spread of disease, right? But vampires were also used to explain the symptoms of diseases, which in turn became signs of vampirism in people's eyes. Take rabies, for instance. PBS reports that rabies outbreaks in the 18th century Europe dovetailed with the rise of vampire stories. Its symptoms included insomnia and the aversion of light. It fits snugly in with our modern day ideas of vampires, don't it? Okay, so who sleeps during the day and who prowls at night? People with rabies, probably. They bite animals. They may bite other people if they're people with rabies, okay? Likewise, pellagra, Pellagra, which results from a corn-heavy diet, can cause an aversion to sunlight as well. Europeans would have been eating more corn than ever before in the 18th century, since they finally had widespread access to Northern American crop. Similarly, the disorder can cause blisters on the skin when the victim is exposed to sunlight, as well as hallucinations. Also, there's the plague. Not only did this disease circulate quickly and seemingly unexpectedly, causing people to seek explanations in ways that stems its spread, but its victims sometimes had bleeding of the mouth lesions. And then there's tuberculosis, which caused such fear in Mercy Brown. Those victims lose weight, cough up blood, and die a slow death. To some, it might seem like supernatural forces were sucking their life away, like consumption. Okay, so then we have Vlad the Impaler. He's just a legend on his own, right? So then you have these diseases, that kind of brought the vampire history to light. And then you have people that wrote about vampires in like the 1700s, kind of like Bram Stoker, for instance. Like between 1845 and 1847, those 2 years, vampire stories spread even wider with Varney the Vampire, a serialized story of penny dreadfuls that described a reluctant vampire named Varney and his misadventures, like a little comic strip. The series laid down some common vampire tropes, like the vampires that have long fangs. And then in 1897, Bram Stoker's Dracula came about. Okay, so additionally, Count Dracula, they have varied over the years. Some films have made him suave, nice looking. Others depict him as terrifying and bloodthirsty. Although Stoker was not the first writer to describe vampires, Dracula has informed many people's ideas of the way the vampire looks and acts. There's a lot of noise going on outside, and if you guys hear it, I apologize. My neighbor's working on his truck. Okay. So, vampires of the real world. So, do vampires really exist? The villagers who dug up Mercy Brown would probably answer with a resounding yes. But the answer really depends on how you define the term vampire. If you think about it, if you're looking for the undead or people who can turn into bats, like Laszlo, then the answer is no. But you have a certain type of violent rulers and serial killers throughout the human history with vampiric tendencies. Like I said, Vlad the Impaler, who allegedly had a taste for blood, known as Vlad Dracula. This ruler impaled thousands of his enemies, once wrote a letter bragging about how he and his warriors killed 23,844 Turks, and this was thought to have been responsible of the deaths of over 60,000 people. Vlad Dracula also allegedly dipped his bread in the blood of his enemies before consuming it. This claim is surprisingly difficult to verify. Some people believe that Bram Stoker based his character Dracula on this ruler. Scholars have debated whether the veracity of this in recent years. The National Geographic reports that Stoker drew from many different sources. However, it is known fact that Stoker came across the name Dracula while reading this history. Afterward, he wrote an important note to himself. Dracula in the Welsh language means devil. Okay. So, then there have also been serial killers, okay, with decidedly vampire tendencies. Take Fritz Haarmann, the early 20th century German serial killer known as the Vampire of Hanover. He earned his nickname because he killed some of his victims by biting through their windpipes, what he called a love bite. Thus, even though vampires may really not be lurking around in dark corners, it's true that these creatures have haunted the human imagination since ancient times. Vampire demons like Lilith first emerged several centuries ago, and medieval fears about death and disease only solidified chilling myths about how the undead could, wreak havoc on communities, like especially small towns back then. But it was writers in recent history who helped define the vampire as we know it today. Poetry like Varney the Vampire and of course Bram Stoker informed the familiar blood-sucking specters that terrified audiences in modern-day times. Making sure that's still on. Today, vampires have taken yet another leap, as we do see like in movies and television shows today, like my favorite shows, True Blood and What We Do in the Shadows, continue to remake the vampire legend anew, even the sparkly ones, like Edward. Yeah, let's not go there, right? So, let me know in the comments what your favorite pop culture vampire is. Are you Team Eric or are you Team Bill for True Blood? Are you Team Jacob or Team Edward? Who knows? Vampires are vampires, but there are different types of vampires, okay? As I was digging into this research on this episode, there is so many different types of vampires. Okay? From ancient myths to modern-day fairy tales, the monsters of our imagination have almost always served the manifestations of real-life fears. The varying interpretations applied to the monsters throughout the centuries only tell us more of the complexities of our fears, and the new forms they take as times change. In regards to vampires, make it a particularly interesting study, okay? So we talked about the past and the pulp culture, so let's talk about the different types, all right? So you have seductive sinners, okay? They like to fall in love with mortals. Examples are like Salma Hayek from Dusk Until Dawn, like an incubi or succubi type. They're good for making deals with immortals and tempting others to sin. What they represent: a reminder to abide by God, resist sin, and don't get flirty with no demons. So you got the medieval. Just like food and hygiene and pretty much everything else in medieval ages, vampires were gross. Vampire hysteria, common in Eastern Europe, where peasants would hang garlic wreaths around homes. So examples would anyone unlucky enough to cough up blood or have abrasions around their mouth during the Middle Ages. What they're good for: dying from disease. What they represent: a warning to stay away from sick-looking people with blood around their mouth because they might infect you with the vampire ick. Good advice. Oh, my favorite type: aristocratic vampires. These aristocratic vampires are romantic and flamboyant and fabulously wealthy. They like throwing lavish parties to have victims they can prey on. They can get them drunk and then drink their blood. Examples: Lestat and Louis from Interview with the Vampire, Lady Gaga in American Horror Story. What they're good for: looking devastatingly glamorous, living luxuriously, being the subject of both hetero and homosexual infatuations, being cruel and cold-hearted, and using their wealth. What they represent: a word of caution that the handsome, dangerous ones are always the ones that break your heart. Fall for their superficial charm at your own peril. Then we have castle-dwelling drama queens. They're angsty, they're depressive, they're dramatic and wallowing in self-pity. These vampires should probably be seeking professional help for perhaps an emotional issue they've accumulated over the hundreds of years they've been alive. Instead, they're sleeping in coffins and playing organ music. Okay, so we have Dracula or Barnabas Collins from Dark Shadows. What they're good for: flaunting black capes better than Batman. What they represent: a failure of society to prevent troubled individuals from becoming evil. Emotional pain that is bad enough to turn anyone into self-pitying recluse. So, nocturnal party animals. What do David Bowie and Tilda Swinton have in common besides their uncanny resemblance? They've both played these types of vampires. First it was Bowie, Catherine Deneuve in the 1980 vampire flick The Hunger. Before it was Swinton, joined by Tom Hiddleston in the more recent Only Lovers Left Alive. These pale, skinny, alcohol-swinging vampires are portrayed as cool, vain, and sexy. Examples are Prometheus Cassidy, the What We Do in the Shadows gang, the vampires from The Lost Boys, The Hunger, and the Only Lovers Left Alive movies. What they're good for: the washed-out vampire rock star look and partying too hard because they're bored of living forever. What they represent is the concept that maybe party people are just modern-day vampires. They come out at night and feed on the fun of drugs, music, and sex so they can feel alive. Nightmare-inducing monsters. Oh, some vampires are less complex than others, frightening us with their repulsive appearance, night-stalking demeanor, and thirst for human blood, simply because of what they are, not because of what they represent. These vampires appear in good old-fashioned horrors that are meant to send chills down your spine with every jump scare and terrifying close-up of bloody, fanged, and yellowy eyes. Examples: Nosferatu and Salem's Lot, 30 Days of Night, and Daybreakers. They're good for scaring the bejesus out of people, and they represent the idea that falling victim to a hideous, blood-crazed monster could be unpleasant and terrifying. For sure. Weapon-wielding goths. Technology made rapid advancements in the 90s and the early 2000s. For the first time, there was widespread access to the internet, and everyone was suddenly equipped with mobile phones, portable music players, and other gadgets which just a decade earlier would have seemed incredibly futuristic. Perhaps not surprising, therefore, are a lot of classical genres received a technological revamp, including the vampires. Look at Blade and Underworld. These vampires are classically 90s with their glossy cyberpunk fashion and confident use technology and weapons, which at that time seemed very modern. So the examples are Blade and Underworld. They're good for performing at the box office. Sick fight scenes, wearing leather and latex, and avenging ancestors and fulfilling prophecies. They represent that vampires can adapt with the times, remain relevant, and cool throughout the centuries. So, here's another example of vampires. Emotionally unavailable hunks. Where were you shipping Angel and Buffy before shipping was even a word in the internet dictionary? Then you know how frustrating the romantic can be between a hero and the attractive but unavailable antagonist for whom they inevitably fall for. Vampires underwent quite a transformation when the hit show The Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Far from being a sickly and scrawny looking, the show helped establish that vampires can also be tanned, gym-going hunks. And who would have thought? They're still emotionally unavailable, however. At least that will never change. Examples are Angel and Spike from Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Bill Compton from True Blood. What are they good for? Eye candy? What do they represent? Well, maybe if you just love him enough, he'll change for you. Here's another one. High school heartthrobs. Emotionally unavailable hunk is split off into a different type of vampire into two, yet becoming some resemblance to the more classical, pale, fragile type of vampire that appeared in the mid-1800s. The high school heartthrob was popularized with the Twilight series, in which the student Bella falls in love with the classmate and immortal vampire Edward. So, blah, 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 werewolf, werewolf, baby, baby. Through the Twilight series, there's a mere decade-old character, Edward, who weirdly doesn't drink blood, but he does sparkle. Has been revisited in countless non-canonical fan fiction, rip-offs, parodies, including the Tantalize book series, the Immortal Romance slot game, to name a few. So examples are Damon and Stefan Salvatore from the Vampire Diaries and Edward Cullen. What they're good for? Literally nothing. They're not good for anything. They're sucky vampires. What they represent? In the case of Twilight, Mormon morals. Soaking. The thing. Okay, so women should really aim higher. Go for those heartthrobs, those emotionally unavailable guys. So those are the 9 types of modern-day pop culture vampires. Tell me what you think in the comments. What'd you like? Okay, so we're going to talk about Energy vampires. Oh man, I had an encounter with one once. She was the ones that say they drink blood, but they have to have like a willing donor. She asked me for my blood. I said no, and I haven't talked to her again. Okay. Energy vampires are people who sap your emotional energy either intentionally or unconsciously. They could be your friends, family members, partners, colleagues, or neighbors who feed on your care and attention and leave you feeling stressed, drained, exhausted, and overwhelmed. This article explores some types of energy vampires. Okay, what are the different types of energy vampires? The victim. Some people enjoy playing the victim card and are always ready with a new sob story about a perceived slight. They are innocent, the whole world is always against them, and they tend to complain even loudly about their problems. So that's them draining your energy when they're telling you a sob story. That's literally sucking your energy away. The criticizer. Some people spend a lot of time and energy criticizing other people, things, or even situations. Nothing is ever good enough for them, and they can find fault with just about anything. The dramatizer. Some people create and attract a lot of drama. They always seem to be in the midst of major catastrophe and often need your help and support. The manipulator. Some people are able to manipulate just about any situation to their advantage. They rarely say what they mean and usually have a hidden agenda. The negative thinker. Some people always see the glass as half empty and have a very negative attitude towards life. They can always be counted on to a point to the downside or potential risk without leaving any room for hope or excitement. And then you have the blamer. Some people are quick to place blame on others. They never fault, and they're always willing to hand out heaps of shame and guilt. So what are some signs about being around an energy vampire? This could be someone that you know. I'm sure you have someone in your life that follows all these examples. Energy vampires are extremely self-centered and always want to be the center of attention. They dominate conversations to ensure the focus is always on them or themselves. If someone else brings up a different topic, they find a way to one-up them and bring the attention back to themselves. For example, they might say, "That sounds like a nice trip. It reminds me of the time when I went to Hawaii. Nothing can compare to how beautiful it was. Let me show you all the pictures I took." Or, "I can't believe you almost got mugged. Did I tell you about the time someone tried to shoot me in a subway?" Yeah. They exaggerate everything. Energy vampires tend to exaggerate every little thing that makes them unhappy. They make everything sound much bigger or better or worse than it actually is. For example, everyone else caught tiny fish, but mine was as big as a house. My body temperature is 99 degrees last night. It was so bad I thought I was going to die. They blame others for everything. They have the blame game. For example, I would have invited you to my party, but you're always so busy that I didn't think you would want to come. They always leave you feeling worn out. Interacting with an energy vampire often elicits an unpleasant emotional reaction that leaves you feeling exhausted and worn out. You may experience negative emotions such as distress, worry, anger, guilt, shame, sadness, disappointment, and confusion. So, how do you protect yourself? Adjust your expectations. If the energy vampire is someone close to you, you may find yourself feeling upset and disappointed when they fail to reciprocate the support that you've shown them. It can help to adjust your expectations and understand that they're never going to show up for you. Seeing them for who they really are can help you take steps required to protect yourself against them. You have to set boundaries in your relationship with this person to limit your exposure to them as much as possible. For instance, if they're colleagues, you may have no choice but to work with them, but you can avoid eating lunch or getting coffee around them. Use your emotional energy. Energy vampires feed off your emotional energy. If you do happen to interact with one, try avoid giving them the reaction they want to their dramatic statements and complaints. Keep a neutral expression and simply shrug them off as though they're not a big deal. If you don't get the reaction they're looking for, they will eventually lose interest and leave you alone. Avoid arguing with them at all costs and learn to say no. If the person is asking you for something, avoid getting sucked into their vortex and just say no. Cut them out of your life if possible. Cut the person out of your life and avoid interacting with them altogether. If they're a colleague or a family member and you can't avoid them, limit your interaction with them and distance yourself from them as much as possible. Please be safe. Because out of all of these vampires that I have been researching, the energy ones, they're kind of the scariest. Because they're real, and sometimes they don't realize they're doing it, but some of them do, and those are the dangerous ones. So now we're going to talk about Philip George Gall, missing since October 13th, 1994, missing from Dayton, Ohio. Classification: endangered, missing. He's a white male. He was born June 1st, 1968. At the age of his disappearance, he was 26. He is 56 now. He is 6 foot tall and he's 250 pounds. His clothing and jewelry description is a black and white checkered flannel shirt and jeans. Distinguishing characteristics: Caucasian male, brown hair, hazel eyes. Gall is balding. His nickname is Phil, and he has a dimple in his chin. Okay, so here's the details of the disappearance. Gall was last seen in Dayton, Ohio on October 13, 1994. He left the home he shared with his wife and infant daughter in the 30 block of the Seminary Avenue at 11 p.m. and boarded the RTA bus to downtown. The bus driver said Gall walked towards the Asylum, a now defunct club on Patterson Road. After he left the bus, he was never seen or heard from again. Gall had signed a lease for a new home the week before he disappeared, and he and his family were preparing to move there. He was not having any personal problems at the time of his disappearance, and it is uncharacteristic of him to leave without warning. He was employed as a roofer at the time of his disappearance and left behind a $1,000 worth of roofing tools. Gall's loved ones decided that he was probably deceased and held a memorial service for him about 9 months after he went missing. His disappearance remains unsolved to this day, and it was last updated a month ago. Yeah, it was updated a month ago. So we're going to read an article about Gall's disappearance. The bus driver told investigators that Gall walked toward the Asylum nightclub and was never seen again. He was declared dead by the state of Ohio in 2002. According to Times reporter, it wasn't until 2008 that rumors of vampires started after a retired Dayton police officer told the Dayton Daily Times that a bartender at the nightclub told him that Gall was killed and beheaded for an occult ritual. It is reported that after Gall's disappearance in 1994, Williams went into a nightclub undercover and noticed it attracted a large gothic vampire crowd. It was while he was undercover that a bartender confided in Williams that Gall's head was sold inside the club. Williams told the Dayton Daily News that the bartender gave enough erratic details to make the story believable. Williams also said that Gall's body was placed in a storm sewer tunnel accessible inside the nightclub. Officers searched for the body but did not find any evidence of a crime, but they did find occult markings. According to Times reporter, the mystery behind Gall's disappearance has led to the birth of an urban legend, with many Dayton residents claiming to have seen a headless man approaching them in the tunnels to ask where his head was. Phelan told Times reporter that producers flew him and his family to Los Angeles 3 years ago to interview him about whether he believed the urban legend is a myth. Phelan tells the news outlet that he does not believe in the urban legend. He believes Gall is with his now deceased mother, who searched for answers about her son's disappearance until her death in 2016. What's on Netflix first announced the documentary directed by Joshua Wolf in February 2024, but George's wife, Helen Gall, and maternal uncle, Dan Phelan, told Times reporter that producers emailed them to tell them that Netflix has decided not to air the show. Phelan told reporters that the documentary changed gears from Gall's disappearance to focus on the community of vampires, with director David Holthouse replaced by Rolfe. The producer on the documentary, M. Elizabeth Hughes, emailed Flynn on August 2nd to confirm that Netflix was not going to air the documentary. According to Times reporter, the family has given up hopes on finding Gall's lasting remains, but they still want to bring attention to his case. Flynn says that any light that shines on the case is a positive light. So that's why I wanted to do this episode. If you have any information on George Phillip Gall, missing since 1994, contact the Dayton Police Department in Ohio. And guess what? Ohio's back in the news again. I can assure you, nobody around here is eating cats and dogs. Okay? Nobody. Maybe a vampire? Because from all the research that I've done, it's just a way of life. Some of them do have donors that, let them drink blood. Some of them just like the lifestyle and the clothes and the romanticizing about it. But yeah, that's my final thoughts. Vampires, kind of weird. Kind of weird if you ask me. But yeah, that was our vampire episode. Let me know what you think in the comments. Are vampires real? Have you ever encountered an energy vampire? Do you have advice for other people that have encountered a vampire? Let me know. And October's episode, we are doing listener-submitted stories. So make sure you submit your story to underthemoonparapod@gmail.com. That's underthemoonparapod@gmail.com. And I will read your story on the show. So that's concluding this month's episode. I'm happy to announce that I am helping out Slap Recon with his ESP Explain Strange podcast with host Taylor Nicole and myself. We have interviews coming up with some paranormal researchers, some cryptid specialists. So yeah, make sure you subscribe to that too. It's Explain Strange podcast with Slap Recon. So make sure you check that out. And yeah, I think that's all I got. Sure is. Alright, so until next time, always remember, stay spooky, my friends!